Well, hi everyone, and welcome to the Engage podcast. Hello, Peter.
It's good to see you, James.
Good to see you too. How are you?
I am doing very well, thank you. There's something different about you this time.
There most certainly is. Why don't you articulate for our loyal watchers, viewers, and indeed listeners what you think is different?
Oh, I can't quite put my finger on it, you know? It looks like your suit has gone.
My suit has gone. It's well and truly gone. Not permanently, you understand. It's a temporary realignment of my clothing.
Right, okay. As flexible as a politician.
Well, I'm just celebrating the incredible weather that we've been having. Temperatures hitting as high, I believe, as 27, 28 degrees for the end of April, beginning of May. That is not too shabby.
Indeed. Or does that mean there's a climate crisis on the way? Who knows? Perhaps we'll get onto it later.
But maybe we should, because according to Tony Blair, there's been a lot of, what was it he said? He used a particular phrase, a lot of alarmist stuff being said about the climate. So yes, let's get into that later. But I'll see what I'll do. I'll compromise. I will take these off, and bearing in mind the command of the Apostle Paul, the encouragement, exhortation of the Apostle Paul, that to be in a room, I'm paraphrasing wildly here, but essentially what he teaches is that men should not wear hats indoors. So therefore, I'm going to 1 Corinthians 11. I'm going to take my hat off in obedience to the apostolic injunction. And speaking of apostolic injunctions, we probably should comment on the passing of Pope Francis.
Yeah.
Can I recommend a podcast? Am I allowed to do that?
Yeah, go for it. Is it a sister podcast again?
You see, this is the problem.
So
no, this is the problem, Peter. You make me laugh a lot, and the problem is when I laugh, I cough. Last night we were in Tunbridge Wells, and I sat at the front, and the seats were quite close together, so I felt a bit trapped, if I'm honest. And I had our illustrious co-founder and his wonderful wife next to me, and then our chief exec on the other side. So in many ways, I was trapped, and I just basically coughed. The only time I wasn't coughing was when I was up front speaking.
Well,
do you know what I mean?
I bet there is something like that where it's almost like the adrenaline kicks in. I was preaching at a church about a couple of months ago, and I was coughing about every 10 seconds.
Yeah.
Until the moment when I was preaching.
And then you're on. And probably the science.
I mean, to be fair, I was praying a lot too, so actually I should credit God rather than adrenaline.
Yes. But yes, that's true. But anyway, I'm sorry. Yes, so my coughing aside, Pope Francis. So
and you were going to recommend a podcast.
Oh, sorry. Yes, the podcast. Thank you. Thank goodness you're here. So the podcast I started listening to is called Inside the Vatican, because these massive news stories happen, and then suddenly you start hearing words like conclave, and I haven't yet seen the film, though it is now available free to watch on Amazon Prime if you're a Prime subscriber. Which I am. Great news.
Yeah.
Have you seen the film Conclave?
I have.
Oh, I honestly, I mustn't say anymore. I'm so excited. I've read the book. I'm so excited. Point is, I wanted a podcast that would help me understand what was going on. And it's so far, it's been absolutely brilliant in terms of explaining the process, explaining sort of the diplomatic kind of things that are going on. Because of course the Pope's a diplomat as well, and all of this. So controversial though it might be, I found it a helpful sort of scene setter.
I almost feel like we're doing product placement. It's like a James Bond film.
You should have heard, that is so true. You should have heard me last night. I was plugging Graham Kendrick's Honey, like you would not believe. And
well done.
Every single jar got sold. Anyway,
very good.
I mean, I did buy one myself. But back on to Pope Francis.
Yes.
Sorry, yes.
Yes.
So, I mean, I suppose, yes, so he sadly, he passes away, and he's aged 88. I think anyone who saw him on Easter Sunday, any of the news clips of him appearing on St. Peter's balcony, he looks so unwell, didn't he? And he's clearly been unwell, had a very lengthy hospital stay. So, I mean, in many ways, probably... Can I put it like this? Sometimes we say that in that sense, it's a good thing. It's a better thing than sort of. It's a hard thing to say, isn't it? Given
I think
strong opposition to assisted suicide. But do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
he's
I do
unwell.
know what you mean. I mean, it did feel slightly morbid to kind of see him being wheeled out when he clearly was quite unwell.
And it had the same thing happen with Pope John Paul II, who had Parkinson's and often looks so unwell. And yet I always used to feel a bit uncomfortable, like, they're wheeling him out again. Like, let the man rest. But anyway.
Well, I guess at this point, what are your thoughts on his legacy, what he stood for?
I in many ways, I'm so ill qualified to comment, because I'm not a Roman Catholic. I'm not an expert, despite listening to that great podcast. I'm not an expert in everything that the Catholic Church teaches and does. But I in another context, in recent weeks, I was reading the Vatican put out a document not that long ago on human dignity, and I was rereading sections of it, and I was just reminded, and it's something we've said often at CARE, that the Catholic Church has had a tremendous tradition of teaching really powerfully and clearly about being made in God's image, about human dignity, about the common good, about the need for us to be engaged in our world for the sake of others, for the sake of loving our neighbour. And these are all themes that we at CARE know and love. And I massively appreciate the fact that in this document, I understand that Pope Francis himself intervened to ask that it be expanded beyond just the typical life issues of abortion, surrogacy, and end of life. And he wanted a human dignity document that was touching on things like war and how that impacts human dignity and poverty. And I also know, from the news stories that I've kind of watched and engaged with, that he's called a the people's pastor or the people's pope. And I think there was something about the simplicity of his life, about his willingness to draw close to people, that, if you think about the Christian teaching, the Bible's teaching on being a pastor and under shepherd, it clearly modeled some of that. And then I also just think about the fact that he would phone the well, I don't know what rank they are, but the main guy in Gaza every day at 7:00, he would phone to check in. So I think there's things that I can appreciate, and I want to thank God for the clarity when it comes to those life issues, human dignity, image of God, and his persistent calls for peace as well. I think is something that's really commendable.
Yeah, I agree with most of that. I think. I guess this is something which the Catholic Church has traditionally done very, very well. When my own denomination, the Anglican Church, has not done it very well. It has kind of taken a much stronger much stronger position on positions of morality, which has been a good thing. Pope Francis, I think, is a really interesting one because the media had a very particular picture they wanted to paint the whole time, didn't they? It was kind of really characterized very early on in that that famous interview he did
on the plane.
Exactly.
Yes.
When he was effectively asked what he would say to someone who was gay. And the line which was quoted without actually the whole sentence, which put it in probably a slightly more helpful context. But the particular line which was always quoted was "Who am I to judge?" And it is worth saying, Francis himself did not make any changes to doctrine, nor would a Pope be allowed, I think, to make changes to doctrine on something like that.
I do sometimes think there's this impression given that, he could have done if he'd wanted to, but I agree with you. I'm not an expert, but I don't quite think that's how it works.
Indeed. And also occasionally, the mask slipped, didn't it?
Yes.
So there were some headlines in the last couple of years about him using somewhat disparaging terms.
I thought you were going to cite that he did a 60-minute interview, and he was asked by the interviewer, who's a woman, what about all the young girls watching? Is there any prospect, for example, that there might be women deacons in the Catholic Church? And of course, at the moment, to be a deacon, you have to receive holy orders, which is why the Church reserves it for men only. And it was a very warm interview, actually, but on that one, he just went, no. and then we moved on, and I thought, that's interesting. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so
bit of a blow for the Liberals there. Yeah,
well, quite. Yeah. So I do absolutely think that the kind of the media picture was not necessarily true to the man. Having said that, I think his emphasis on kind of simplicity was probably quite a helpful thing when you consider the Catholic Church's many financial assets.
Indeed, yes. In fact, you and I have both been to Rome. You, I think, more than me. But one of the things that our host told us to look out for was the Vatican symbol over a building, signifying that it belonged to the Holy See. Because, of course, you think, the Vatican, it's got its own buildings in its own country. But actually, all the way around Rome, it owns so many properties. Mine kind of boggles, and that applies across the board, actually. In other countries
completely.
As well.
One thing which I think he probably was quite good for. I'll start with this one, and then I'll go to something I thought he was less good for. One thing I did think he was quite good for was the idea of effectively the church being a hospital, and so kind of meeting people in brokenness, because we look at Jesus and he does not just go to all those who have got things sorted. And so the emphasis on that, I thought, again, was a helpful thing.
You were going to mention something you thought he was not so good at?
Yeah. So I think he more than his predecessor ended up being quite confusing for people to understand, because you sort of got slightly contradictory messages. It was like he tried to say what someone wanted to hear sometimes.
Yes.
And so in its own way, the who am I to judge comment is an example of that.
Yes.
And I think, certainly I know Catholics who were not massive fans of it.
No, same here. And I interestingly, one of my closest friends from Edinburgh who attends the cathedral there, St Mary's, and so I sent him a message, just expressing, I don't really know what I was expressing, so just that I was thinking of him at this time and so on, and he's not always been a fan, but he sort of came back and said he was such a pastor, and I
think that's helpful actually.
Almost kind of, though, sometimes was the Achilles heel, right? Because I likewise had similar experience of, I think clearly there were some Catholics who there was this whole hoo-ha about the permission to bless same-sex unions, which wasn't a change in doctrine, but there was sort of a document that came out, then it got withdrawn, then something else, and there had to be clarifications, and all of that, partly, you have to say, stemming, it seems, from this sort of way in which he operated, which was, he was very so one commentator, I don't know if they're a fan or not, but they said, we've never had a pope, or not recently, who's so PR savvy.
Yes, I felt that actually.
And knows exactly how to present things and to kind of put if you're being uncharitable, a spin on things, or just knows how the media works and can offer lines that will carry the news bulletins. And that is both a blessing, but it can be a curse as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess to add one additional example, also like not really very helpful on Ukraine as well. No, and telling them to raise the white flag.
Yes,
that wasn't great.
Yeah, it's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. Well, actually, ironically, had more in common perhaps with someone like Donald Trump.
I know, this is the great irony, isn't it?
Just surrender, surrender, just stop. World War III is going to happen. Just stop.
Completely. Had been so anti-Trump on say Trump's immigration policies. And finds himself probably more aligned on that.
I tell you where, again, coming back to that document on human dignity, I think another area where I thought it was tonally very helpful was on the whole question of gender or transgender and what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. They didn't really go much into that, but they were more just saying, God has designed us male and female. And I thought that was fits in with the helpful teaching that the Catholic Church has offered on being an image bearer of God. And of course, if I can now use this for a brilliant segue, really relevant in the light of the recent decision by the UK Supreme Court.
I didn't even see that segue coming. Well done.
Our producer's given up. That was a brilliant segue. You should have been standing up and applauding. But why don't we just reflect on really quite a momentous ruling from the UK Supreme Court? And just in simple layman's terms, for anyone who's forgotten or hasn't read the story yet. So there was a court case. Eventually, it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. And it was a question, which is, in the Equality Act of 2010, when the Equality Act says woman, which obviously it's going to do, does it mean woman as a gendered construct? In other words, does that refer to both biological women, but also trans women as well? Or does it mean women on the basis of biological sex? And so obviously, coming as we do from our vantage point, we believe the Bible, we think God makes us male and female. We were hoping for an outcome where the highest court in our land said it means biological sex. And lo and behold, that's precisely what the judgment said, which is fantastic.
It is. I think we also shouldn't lose sight of the context of the case, which is who the two sides were. So on one side you had
J.K. Rowling. No, not just her.
On one side you had a campaign group for Women Scotland. So they believe in the primacy of biological sex.
Scotland as well. Yeah.
But on the other side, you had the actual Scottish government.
Yes.
And I mean, it is baffling to me how effectively one of the governments of the UK found itself in that position.
Well, I mean, can I just make a quick point here, which is that the Scottish government does have a somewhat murky history of being taken to court. So it's been taken to court, for example, famously losing over the named person scheme in Scotland back in 2014, 2015. But there have been other legal challenges where the Scottish government have made representations. I think part of it was to do with COVID, for example. And then, of course, you had the whole hoo-ha of the Alex Salmond, Nicola Sturgeon kind of breakdown. So they do seem to have a bit of a pattern for being taken to court.
Well, James, you're from Scotland.
Yes. So of course, now I must explain why this is. I think on this one, I think we want to pay tribute to what was the campaign group called again?
For Women Scotland.
I get those words all muddled up. For Women Scotland, and they've been pursuing this for a good number. This is not by the whenever something comes to the Supreme Court, it has gone through various rounds beforehand, and often if it's on the basis of appeal, it's because decisions have been made in lower courts that actually are not to the liking of this campaign group. And so I think pay tribute to them for their persistence, and they celebrated on that day, and I can understand why. And I think one of the practical outworkings of this ruling is that when it comes to the offering of public facilities, for example, and toilets, basically, that there must be single-sex spaces made available. Yeah. But the ruling did also say that there should be accommodation made where practical for trans people as well. And so you end up, essentially what they're saying is, you need to come up with a system that addresses both.
Oh, completely. And I think the key thing, though, which you just brought in was what exactly does a single-sex space mean?
Yes.
Well, it means what it says on the tin.
Exactly, yes.
So a single-sex space should not then be accessed by someone who is biologically of a different sex, but just identifies as say, a woman. It's been really interesting seeing what has happened since the ruling as well.
Yes.
You're right. Actually, before we get on to what's happened since, let's just round off something else which I think was quite helpful. So the question then is, what do you do in terms of spaces for people who are transgender?
Yes.
And as you rightly pointed out, what has been suggested is effectively you create a third space for them to use. And the reason I'm just stopping where I was about to go is because I've certainly found, and you might have found on this as well, that if we go out and speak on the road, the question sometimes comes up.
Yeah, it does.
Like, I'm part of this church. What should we do about someone who's transgender who wants to use a bathroom? I don't know whether you found that. I've certainly had that question.
No, I have,
the way I have tended to answer it is to suggest something similar, I think, which is
the same here.
Which is, do you, if you possibly can, to try and create a third space, so like an accessible toilet.
Interestingly, I did a couple of years training in a church, and they were sort of building a new building while I was there, and they made the decision that they looked ahead and they anticipated, basically, this is likely to become an increasing issue for us. There's a way that we can just knock this on the head. And so their toilets are, I don't know what the official terminology is, but they don't have single-sex spaces. They're men and women shared toilets, all of them.
So just one kind of space?
Just one kind of space for absolutely everybody. And I must say, when I first kind of encountered it, I was like, oh, I'm not going to like this. But what they also did was, I think, and I could be wrong on this, they didn't build, this is going to get very technical. I can't believe I'm using this term on the Engage pod. They didn't build any urinals at all. So it was all just, and it was private cubicles. And they built enough of them so that, and I actually, genuinely, they also had, to be fair, they did have disabled access toilet that was separated off. I actually found that because of the fact it was a big solid door that I was closing behind me on the cubicle, and this sounds so silly, it wasn't one of those flimsy, horrible plastic things in kind of a horrible shopping centre. It was a proper, nicely designed door. I actually felt completely private, and I think I'm right in saying they may even have had little sinks in each cubicle. Sure. And so they'd really put a lot of thought into this as just one way that you can do it.
Yeah, and I guess different spaces will do it differently, and there are limitations which you might have because of finances or whatever. And I think instinctively I prefer having three spaces to having one space. And part of the Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. One, look, we're both men. Let's just be realistic. Men do not always leave the bathrooms in the best state.
So speak for yourself, Peter.
Well, no. I mean, I am immaculate, but just pragmatically, we know that is the case. And secondly, I think from a point of view of safety for, say, women who might feel vulnerable.
I think that's right.
Even with just for one space, I think some might still feel at risk.
And I can understand as well why, again, equality legislation touches on so many parts of our lives, when it comes to employment, for example, and so on. And I can understand why churches might feel that they want to publish statements, for example, that
completely.
just set out where they stand on this. So it's sort of, they're not hiding it. They're not trying to, be secretive about it, but are upfront. This is what we believe. This is where we stand. As always, with this kind of, the ruling talks about the need to offer compassion to trans people, and I suppose there's always two things that I always feel when I see that. One is, I think that when there is a genuine, and I use that word very, very deliberately, when there is a genuine case of genuine gender dysphoria, it is horrendous. It's a horrible thing to experience. But a bit like assisted suicide, is it genuinely compassionate to encourage someone down the road of life-altering operations and potentially puberty blockers as well, and so on and so forth? And I would argue, based on evidence, but also I think based on the biblical teaching that we're made by God, knitted together in our mother's womb, Psalm 139, that true compassion is never to recommend that someone goes through that sort of surgery, that they should be helped in every way possible to live in their God-given biological sex. And, that to me, to say we must treat them with compassion, how can I disagree with that? I'm a Christian. We're called to love our neighbour. But love is always in the Christian teaching linked with truth, isn't it? And so that's the combination that where then you begin to disagree with some of the finer details, perhaps, of how this might be implemented. So we will. To me, this is the big question, which is this is a great result. It is actually going to be challenged by the UK's only openly transgender judge. And so we'll see where that goes.
Well, let's come on to the response of various different groups of people.
What about our Prime Minister? What did you think of his response? Where was it?
he would say, he has always believed in...
I did find that a bit infuriating.
Well, because we all know it's not true.
Yes. So just for clarity, there was a point where Keir Starmer has been asked on public record, I believe, there was a media interview, what is a woman, and did he think trans women were women, I think was the question, and he effectively said yes, and so something to do with the cervix involved as well, I believe. And then now all of a sudden he's rode in, he took 6 days to respond to the UK Supreme Court
which was
ruling.
Itself interesting.
Massively revealing. Massively revealing.
Why do you think he has taken so long? Because I would have my theory, but I'd be interested in what yours would be. Is it because you think he doesn't agree with it? Or do you think it's for political reasons and being worried about the response within his own party? Because I think it's more likely the latter.
Yeah, there's part of me that wonders, this was a hefty ruling by the Supreme Court, running into multiple pages, and Keir Starmer is a lawyer by training. I wondered whether, he's the kind of person who would not want 3 talking points from some of the policy wonks in Downing Street summarising what's happened. He would probably want to read the entire judgment himself. And he just strikes me as that kind of guy.
I think that's probably fair.
Whether he does it, at nighttime, bedtime reading, I don't know, don't really care. But I think it reflects his personality. He's not someone given to rushed judgments. He's not someone who, sometimes I think to a fault, and I think in this case to a fault. So there could have been those factors feeding in. I think that would explain perhaps a couple of days waiting while they maybe talk to government lawyers and make sure that what he says is compliant with any other law or whatever. But the fact it was 6 days, I think, suggests it was more of an issue of party management.
Yeah.
Debating, talking, discussing with the backbenchers. What can we say here? But what I found so interesting is now that Starmer's come out and said that, mostly the cabinet are falling into line mostly behind him, including the Justice Secretary, who's come out very strongly at committee just this week and said it is completely unacceptable to challenge the UK Supreme Court's ruling. I think this is great.
Yeah, no, so the Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, I think we've been big supporters of what she's done on assisted suicide as well.
Massively, yes.
I was really glad to see her say that. The interesting thing, of course, about the Labour Party more generally is so yes, this is what the cabinet are saying, but there would be much more division in the Labour Party as a whole, wouldn't there? So you had a number of MPs who effectively signed something saying that the Supreme Court judgment was terrible. I mean, it's all. I guess the Conservatives had this when they were in office as well, didn't they? But you get all these leaked WhatsApp messages between different MPs who are sort of saying, "Oh, this is really terrible." So, one of the figures whose name keeps on being mentioned would be Angela Eagle, for instance, who would be well known for her support of trans rights.
Do you think that?
Go on.
Well, so as you were talking there, I kind of a very practical question came into my mind, which is part of kind of where do we go from here, I suppose. So, that's how Labour responded, and certainly PMQs after the ruling, Kemi Badenoch probably had one of her best outings because she sort of pulverised him over
specialist subjects.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, she has been consistent on this, and she pulverised him over his flip flopping and so on. That's the kind of political response. So. We obviously think this is a really good outcome.
Absolutely.
Do you think sort of Christians being quite triumphalistic about this?
That's a really good question.
Is right or wrong, and why? And so how do we rejoice in this in a way that it doesn't kind of slip into a kind of almost nasty kind of... nasty triumphalism. I suppose it's an interesting question, isn't it? Like, what would that kind of triumphalism say? What kind of message would that send, perhaps, to someone who does come into your church, who identifies according to their own beliefs as the opposite of their actual biological sex? And so, how do we guard against that?
Yeah, and there's a distinction, I think, to be potentially made between the way we might speak to an individual whom this personally affects, and the way in which we might be arguing publicly about what the government should or shouldn't do, because the two scenarios are slightly different. Yeah. So certainly we are always to try and marry grace and truth.
Yes.
And so I certainly don't think that we should be kind of vaunting over people. One of the tricky things with this particular topic is that those particularly who are taking up the trans flag have been really exceptionally aggressive. And so I can completely understand why some, like J.K. Rowling, are now kind of... Well, I think they've almost given up trying to engage on a sort of slightly gentler level, because they've realised they're never getting it back. So I do understand why they are taking things the way they are doing. You've opened up your Bible.
Well, yes. Oh, it's what a moment. Yes, like it's happened. I just, as you were talking there, I thought of Jesus' words around loving your enemy. You've heard it said, this is Matthew 5:43. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. I mean, that's amazing, isn't it? Because he connects doing that with your identity as a child of God. And this is what children of God do, that we pray for those who persecute us. So I think that's part of the response. What about that other teaching of, turning the other cheek? I wonder if that perhaps as well, in terms of, the whole thing is so tempting when stones are thrown at us to where's the biggest boulder, and absolutely launch it back. Whereas there's that Christian emphasis on actually it's not weakness, it's actually strength to say I'm going to turn the other cheek, and I'm not going to what was it Michelle Obama said, when they go low, you go high.
Yeah.
It's that kind of thing, isn't it?
Well, which is, I guess, ultimately is embodied in Jesus, isn't it?
Oh,
so
yes,
the
yes.
ultimate example of loving your enemies
Yes.
is
Yes.
Jesus saying, Father, forgive them.
Oh, yeah. It's stunning, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's
so hard to live up to.
It is so countercultural.
Yes.
And
yeah.
it so doesn't come naturally
I
to
think
us
that's
as well.
right. I think it's so funny, isn't it? Because we talk about this as a culture war issue. And we want to offer a counterculture, both in terms of insisting, dogmatically, God made us male and female, with all that means. But the way that we do that has to be a countercultural to the way that, even successful non-Christian groups who advocate in this very issue, where there's a lot of agreement between us and them, but we want the way that we speak about this issue to be distinct from the way that they speak about this issue.
Oh, absolutely.
And so you won't see me, for example, posting a picture of myself with a big cigar in my hand. not only because
many reasons.
For many reasons. Not I wish I did have access to a lovely boat in wherever it was. But no, and that's, by the way, that I think you're right. What you said is absolutely right. That's not a criticism. I don't mean it as a criticism of J.K. Rowling. I'm more just saying that I think this, how we engage in this debate matters, as much as what we're saying, if we want to be consistently Christ-like in how we sort of respond. So,
okay, next question.
Yes.
Do you think this is the last we're going to hear?
No.
Somehow I agree.
No, it just can't be, because
Yeah.
not only will there be court challenges to this, so that will rumble on in the background, but also, I mean, you look in the Bible, what does Satan do all the time? He counterattacks. You see it in Acts, for example, he tries to kind of get into the church and you've got the whole kind of first martyr of Stephen. Well, actually, his first attempt is he sows seeds of discord within the church. There's a dispute, and that leads to the creation of deacons. So the church respond well. So then he goes, I know what I'll do. I'll take out one of their primary kind of guys. I'll take Stephen out. And so, yes, there will be a counterattack. But it's a spiritual battle that we're engaged in at the end of the day. And so I suspect, a bit like a kind of wounded animal, that the particularly aggressive pro-trans, pro-LGBT ideology groups will look to kind of counterattack. And I think there's a long way to go in terms of what's been going on in schools and in our education institutions in terms of seeing an end to this ideology being perpetrated. It's funny, isn't it? Because you're seeing some things happen, like the FA, for example. They were saying that actually trans women will not be allowed to play football.
Which was a reversal of this policy from just 3 weeks ago.
Which is amazing. I mean, again, and this is what I mean by we also need to be not naive and think, it's just an uninterrupted kind of move now. The backlash will carry on. I think the trajectory seems set in a good direction, but that doesn't mean there'll be some bumps along the way.
Certainly. And so just to give a couple of examples of people who are already speaking out quite strongly against the judgment. So the BMA, what was formerly known as the junior doctors, now known as resident doctors. So this is not the official BMA position, but the position of the BMA's resident doctors voted to condemn the judgment, calling it biologically nonsensical.
I mean, that is nonsensical.
Yeah.
What they've said is nonsensical.
No, I know. So that represents about 50,000 doctors who are training.
Yeah. That doesn't fill me with great confidence about the future of medical
no, it doesn't.
practice in our country.
Does it?
Yeah.
They claimed that the judgment had no basis in science or medicine while being actively harmful to transgender and gender diverse people. I mean, with something like that, I just almost do not know where to
Where'd you start? Yeah.
The other big story, which has been making quite a lot of headlines, was did you see the letter from some actors?
Including all the actors who made their livelihoods through the Harry Potter films.
Well, not to be fair, it didn't include the big three this time. But
it didn't.
No,
I just assumed that they would all be jumping on it. But Eddie Redmayne.
Eddie Redmayne,
who's made a lot of money out of the Harry Potter films, because he was, of course, Newt Scaram, whatever his name is. Scamander, beg your pardon. But he was Newt. Yeah, because he wasn't in the originals, was he? But he was this new franchise spin-off. Yeah.
And there are various others.
Yes.
But also the media loves to kind of play up the Harry Potter angle.
I know.
I mean, it mentioned one actor who had been like in the background of one scene.
Oh, that was Charlotte Ritchie,
Yeah,
who was
yeah.
in the background of Goblet of Fire.
Which I didn't even know.
No, I didn't know that. No,
until
I
read that
yes, I was
article.
the same. Yes, 400 of them have said, "Oh, this is awful. This is terrible." And you think,
Yeah.
stop, you know what? Did you learn nothing? Like, stop lecturing us around what we should think just because you've got privilege and power.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
The other thing which I think is very unfortunate around this whole debate, and I suspect this is partly where I wonder whether this is partly where say the doctors might be coming from, is that there is this very unfortunate conflation of two different things. Conflation of people who are intersex, which is a very, very rare condition, but which is a genuine condition, and people who are identifying as transgender.
Yeah.
And so intersex people do exist. They certainly don't exist in anything like the numbers which activists would claim.
No.
So the figure which activists will sometimes put about would be 1.7% of people are intersex. And that is absolutely not the case at all.
No.
In terms of the percentage who we would normally think of as intersex, I think it's 0.018% of people. I think it's that. It's certainly vanishingly small.
Yes.
And 100 times smaller than it's claimed to be.
Yeah.
But that is a legitimate medical thing. And then you've got people who are identifying as transgender, which is primarily a mental thing.
Yes.
It is not a biological thing.
No.
And conflating the two, I think, is very unhelpful.
Yeah.
Because intersex people absolutely do need support to effectively to work out how they are to live their lives.
Yeah.
Something which is essentially a kind of internal mental battle to work out who you are. That is a very different kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And if you would like to know more about this topic, then please do head to our website, care.org.uk, where a couple of things, you'll find a whole cause section or topic section that is on the transgender question. But you'll also find the primer video at the top of that page, also available on our YouTube channel. Very, very helpful in sort of sending out the kind of current lay of the land. And, you know, the Supreme Court ruling, of course, does build on the Hillary Cass review, which we've written about extensively for the website, which was very, very, again, very, very helpful. So the overall picture does seem to be moving in a good direction, and it just remains to be seen how this is now kind of worked out. Worth flagging that the ECHR, which is the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, is running has issued updated guidance, but is also running a number of consultations on this very topic. And so again, it'd be worth just, if you're minded to do this, it would be worth engaging with that and offering your views as well. Now,
are we headed somewhere else?
We're going to head somewhere else, yes. So there's no natural segue to head into this new space. But I think...
no, I would love to see you have a go at this
I honestly I was thinking about it at the back of my mind, but I haven't had time to form one. So I was trying to kind of... I was going to use a line that was basically like, you know, if that happens and that happens and that happens, then, you know, there's no net gain. In fact, it's net zero. Wow, look at that segue. Did you like that one, Isaac? Yeah, okay. At least that got a nod. And he's awake. He's awake.
It's James Transition Mildred.
Yeah, that's it. I'd love the challenge of how do you... So net zero, I don't think we've ever really spoken specifically about net zero on this podcast. So what has prompted us to talk about it today?
Well, there was a much publicised intervention in the shape of a foreword from Tony Blair. He's written this forward to a report from his institute, the Tony Blair Institute, essentially criticising, or at least this is what the media have run with, sort of saying leaders are terrified to say that their climate policies aren't working, saying that the kind of present policy solutions are inadequate, saying that it's unrealistic, it's unworkable. And now that has been perceived as a pretty heavy attack on the Environment Secretary. He's obviously Energy Secretary.
He's the Energy
Secretary. It's Steve Reed's Environment Secretary.
That's right, yeah.
Energy Secretary Ed Miliband, who, of course, Mr. Blair did not always see eye to eye with back in the day anyway.
No.
So net zero, what are our thoughts?
Well, I mean, Tony Blair has always had the ability to communicate very, very effectively. And there was things that he said in his foreword. For example, that a lot of the language used when talking about climate change is very alarmist and kind of a bit unbalanced, basically. And I think that's true.
Yeah.
I think that some of the more radical forms of sort of environmentalism are a form of sort of pagan idolatry, a kind of a worshipping of the planet Earth, which is very unhelpful. And also this whole horrendous idea that the real problem is human beings and the sort of downplaying of the special status that humans can, should, and always must enjoy in this creation, because that's the status God gives us. I think the absence often of a concept of stewardship is hugely problematic, because the Christian teaching is that the world has been given to us by God, that we are stewards of it under Him. So I think that bit was good. I thought what he said there about people are being asked to make financial sacrifices, essentially in the context of cost of living with other problems in the world, and they're not entirely clear what the benefit of doing so is.
Marginal gains.
Feel the benefit. Yeah. But the thing I also appreciated was that he did also offer some suggestions for what could be done. So a renewed international push, for example, to get China and India to cut their emissions. Well, I mean, China in 2023, I think 32.68% of global emissions came from China. America was the second, 13 point something percent, just to give you an indication of the gap. The UK has actually done very, very well in cutting its emissions. And so Blair's point was carbon capture is a good idea, big international push to get China and India to cut their emissions. Let's invest in some small scale nuclear energy sites as well. That seems very, very moderate and very, very sensible. And dare I say it, here is Tony Blair, the architect of the third way, or the kind of one of the best proponents of the third way in British politics, of synthesizing the right and the left and coming up with that. And I think he's doing it again. And I think a lot of people out there will read this, if they do read it, or if they hear the more balanced perspective, they will go, this pretty much gets to where I'm at. I do think that we should be doing something. I am concerned about the state of the planet. I'm not alarmist about it. And I think that we need solutions that aren't going to mean that I'm going to be financially worse off. I think that's where a lot of people are.
Yeah, I think that's a very good summary of it. And I think the concept of stewardship, you rightly identified as a key one. Because we don't just care for the Earth's own sake. And this is perhaps one of the big differences between the way we might approach effectively what we call creation care and the approach which many secular environmentalists might take. I remember the final sentence of King Charles's statement at the opening of COP28, where I had my head in my hands. The Earth does not belong to us. That's okay so far. We belong to the Earth.
That's those mumbo jumbo. I mean, what does that even mean?
Well, it's completely pagan.
Yes,
I mean, that is the worldview of the Greeks and the Romans, and we believe that the Earth is the Lord's. So fine, the Earth does not fully belong to us.
Yes,
but we are delegated responsibility, but by God, who has created us in His image. Adam's first ever job is as a gardener. We are to kind of have we are to care for creation and love creation in the way that God loves it.
I sort of feel about this the way I feel about any kind of advocacy issue, that I want Christians to care about things that are going on. So if your particular thing is you're concerned about the environment, I don't think that is necessarily a problem. For all of us, however, there is the red flag that we need to be aware of, that if this advocacy issue like environmentalism is something that we end up talking about more than we're talking about Jesus himself, or we're, it's affecting our ability to connect well with churches, it's with our local churches, affecting our ability to invest in proper relationships with our brothers and sisters, leading us dangerously close to disobeying the injunction of doing good to all, especially to those in the household of faith. These are the red flags that you need to be aware of. If your passionate advocacy for the environmentalism is something that you're thinking about more than you are about cultivating the relationship you enjoy with your Heavenly Father through Christ by the power of the Spirit, then that is a big red flag. So one of the things I've always liked about Blair is that, generally speaking, with some terrible exceptions, he has charted that sort of middle ground. And there's something, and maybe it's the moderate within me. I know what you're all thinking. What you a moderate? But there is a moderate part of me that kind of connects with that. I know it doesn't come out very often, but it's having an awakening right now.
It comes out more often than you're pretending it does.
Oh, that's very good.
But yeah,
moderate, James.
I think you're right. I mean, and Blair has an ability to kind of get where people are at and to connect with them, doesn't he?
Yes.
I also liked what you mentioned there a couple of answers ago about this is not just a Britain problem. And in Britain, I think I'm right in saying like our net emissions are sort of like lower than they were since the Industrial Revolution.
I think that's right.
We have done a really good job in terms of lessening stuff down.
Yeah,
but it can't possibly work unless you do this throughout the world.
And that's where this. I mean, my concern with the whole net zero thing, the Miliband thing, is that I think it's built on a kind of naive optimism, and I think it's also built upon a kind of an ideological, also maybe a political kind of like, oh, we've got to do this to appease this group or that group.
I don't know if it's political. I think he is just ideological, and I would perhaps uncharitably say ideologically a bit mental on it. I think there is this naive optimism.
Yes.
Which is saying, oh, we can have all of this. We can have our cake and eat it. We can have great green energy, and our prices will still stay low. Well, that is absolutely not the case at all.
No.
And what is currently likely to happen is we will have no energy security at all.
Yes.
And when the sun is not shining or we don't have our solar power, then we're going to be really stuck.
Exactly. And I think some are arguing that is ultimately what lies behind the problems they've had in Spain and Portugal, which is a lack of energy security because of an over-reliance on renewable energy sources that cannot bear the weight of the demands that we're placing on it.
Yeah, and even then, you look at some of the technology which you need for certain types of renewable energy, and like, where are we getting, say, the microchips from?
Yeah.
Well, we don't get them here, do we?
No, and it's the same with electric cars, the batteries.
Exactly. If you're ordering some of this stuff in from overseas, well, you've got to make sure that you are not kind of placing too much reliance on a country which might end up not being your ally.
Yeah.
And there's absolutely a danger of that as well.
I agree. Moving finally from net zero, we wanted to finish very, very briefly by talking, as we often have done on this podcast, just about the assisted suicide bill, because it's not good news at all. I mean, it's frustrating news that both the assisted suicide bill in Scotland, stage 1 debate, and the assisted suicide bill at Westminster, which is a third reading debate, will take place in the same week. So back to back, as it were. And I don't know what's going to happen. There was a Time story out, interestingly, today, day of recording, which suggested a majority of MPs have now turned against the bill. Now, you've got to be very, very careful with reading too much into these stories. But what that speaks to, I think, is the fact that, this really is sort of all to play for territory, in that this bill in Westminster can be defeated. We need 28 MPs to change their mind. And so I just... very, very aware that on the 16th of May is coming very, very quickly. And it's a massive moment for our country.
So I guess what can people do? First of all, they can be writing to their MPs.
Yeah, write to your MP.
And that doesn't have to be via email. If you write a letter, they might be even more likely to respond because they don't necessarily receive as many letters anymore.
And a little tip that we were told was don't put assisted suicide or assisted dying in your subject line if you are emailing. Put something a bit more generic because then it will get closer to the top of the MP's inbox, apparently.
And if you are able to even secure a meeting with your MP, well, that's even better. And do kind of come prepared, know what you want to say in it. Do be praying.
Yes, definitely.
I guess if you went back to where we were back in the end of November, and I remember I think I was on long read duty the day of the
yes, you were a dark
vote.
day for Britain.
And I think my final point in it was something like I would still be praying for a miracle. Because at that point things seemed impossible to overturn.
Yes.
I don't think it is impossible that it is overturned, but we absolutely need God to be at work in terms of changing people's hearts, don't we?
Oh, we absolutely do. Yeah.
Is there anything else people can be doing?
I just encourage you, I think this is an issue where we need to keep reminding ourselves as to why we think this is a bad idea and what we are for, which is the availability of palliative care for everybody. So again, the CARE website, care.org.uk, there's a whole topic page devoted to assisted suicide in terms of giving you some fantastic resources, 10 things you need to know, a topic guide that you can engage with digitally. You could ask us to send some copies. We're going to be updating that in light of the votes in Holyrood and Westminster, and then reissuing that. So that's going to have longevity far beyond these votes. So there's lots on the website, lots that you can order in from the care office if you'd like to. And I think just continually interacting with those key biblical principles, image of God, human dignity, what's real compassion looks like, and the sovereignty of God over human life.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Well, Peter, we've done it again. We've managed to traverse between Pope Francis all the way through to net zero via the UK Supreme Court's ruling on gender, and then we finished with the topic of assisted suicide. Is there anything we will not discuss on this podcast?
I feel like I need to lie down after that, to
honestly,
be honest.
and an ice cream maybe with the sunshine. And in fact, why don't I end how I began the podcast, just as we bring this podcast to an end?
I do find it so funny.